To approach the philosophy of George Orwell is to enter a terrain where politics, language, and epistemology are inseparably entangled. Orwell does not construct a formal philosophical system. Instead, he develops a mode of critique grounded in observation, clarity, and an insistence that thought must resist distortion. His work operates less as abstract theory and more as a diagnostic instrument, one that reveals how power infiltrates not only institutions, but the very medium through which reality is apprehended, language itself. At the center of Orwell's philosophical orientation lies a fundamental claim. The corruption of language and the corruption of thought are mutually reinforcing processes. Language is not a neutral tool. It is an active medium that shapes perception, organizes experience, and delimits what can be meaningfully articulated. When language becomes imprecise, euphemistic, or ideologically loaded, it does not merely obscure reality, it restructures it at the level of cognition. This restructuring is not accidental. Orwell identifies a deliberate dynamic in which political power seeks to manipulate linguistic structures in order to stabilize its own authority. The more language is saturated with ambiguity and abstraction, the easier it becomes to conceal contradictions, justify violence, and normalize incoherence. Words cease to refer clearly to things. Instead, they function as instruments of persuasion detached from empirical grounding. This detachment introduces a condition in which truth becomes increasingly difficult to isolate. If language no longer corresponds reliably to reality, then the criteria for evaluating statements shift from accuracy to utility. What matters is not whether something is true, but whether it serves a particular interest. In such a context, the distinction between fact and interpretation begins to erode, giving way to a fluid environment in which competing narratives vie for dominance without stable reference points. Orwell's response to this condition is not to abandon language, but to reclaim it through precision. Clarity becomes an ethical as well as intellectual imperative. To write clearly is to resist manipulation. To think clearly is to maintain a connection to reality that cannot be easily overridden by external pressures. This insistence on clarity is not merely stylistic, it is philosophical. It reflects a commitment to the idea that truth, while often contested, is not infinitely malleable. However, Orwell's position is not naively optimistic. He recognizes that individuals are not fully autonomous in their use of language. They inherit linguistic frameworks shaped by history, culture, and power structures. These frameworks influence not only how people communicate, but how they think. Thus, the effort to maintain clarity requires continuous vigilance, a deliberate effort to interrogate one's own assumptions and expressions. This vigilance becomes particularly important in the context of ideology. Orwell views ideology not simply as a set of beliefs, but as a closed system of interpretation, one that filters experience in such a way that contradictory evidence is either ignored or reinterpreted to fit pre-existing conclusions. Within such systems, language functions as a mechanism of reinforcement, repeating formulas and slogans that reduce complex realities to simplified narratives. The danger of ideological language lies in its capacity to produce cognitive insulation. By providing ready-made interpretations, it reduces the need for independent thought. Individuals come to rely on linguistic templates rather than engaging directly with the complexity of the world. Over time, this reliance weakens the capacity for critical reflection, making it easier for external authorities to shape perception. This dynamic reaches its most extreme form in the concept of controlled language, exemplified in Orwell's fictional constructions. Here, language is not merely influenced by power but systematically engineered to eliminate undesirable forms of thought. Vocabulary is reduced, meanings are narrowed, and ambiguities are eliminated, not in the service of clarity, but in the service of control. The goal is not better communication but the restriction of cognitive possibility. What emerges from this analysis is a profound insight. Freedom of thought is inseparable from freedom of language. To constrain language is to constrain the range of possible thoughts. To distort language is to distort the structure of reasoning itself. Political domination, therefore, does not require constant coercion if it can operate at the level of cognition. Control the medium of thought, and the need for overt force diminishes. Yet Orwell does not present this process as inevitable. His emphasis on clarity, honesty, and direct engagement with reality suggests that resistance remains possible. This resistance begins at the level of individual practice, through careful use of language, attention to meaning, and a refusal to accept ready-made formulations without scrutiny. It extends outward into collective discourse, where the preservation of shared standards of truth becomes essential for maintaining a functioning public sphere. The public sphere, in Orwell's implicit philosophy, depends on a minimal level of linguistic integrity. Without it, communication collapses into competing distortions, and the possibility of rational deliberation disappears. In such a context, power no longer needs to justify itself through argument. It can rely on confusion, repetition, and the erosion of conceptual distinctions. This erosion is not merely a linguistic phenomenon, but an epistemological one. As distinctions blur, the capacity to differentiate between truth and falsehood, between evidence and assertion, weakens. The result is a form of epistemic instability in which beliefs are held not because they correspond to reality, but because they are reinforced by social or political structures. Orwell's analysis thus extends beyond language into a broader critique of the conditions under which knowledge is produced and sustained. He is concerned not only with what people say, but with how they come to believe what they say, and how those beliefs are maintained in the face of contradiction. This concern leads him to examine the role of memory, history, and narrative in shaping collective understanding. Memory, in particular, becomes a site of contestation. If the past can be reinterpreted or rewritten, then the present loses its anchor. Without a stable reference to what has occurred, it becomes difficult to evaluate current claims or anticipate future consequences. Control over historical narrative thus becomes another dimension of power, one that complements the manipulation of language. In this framework, truth is not self-sustaining. It requires continuous reinforcement through accurate language, reliable memory, and critical engagement. When these supports are weakened, truth becomes vulnerable, not because it ceases to exist, but because it becomes increasingly difficult to access and defend. This vulnerability introduces a persistent tension within Orwell's philosophy, the recognition that while truth is objective, the means of apprehending it are fragile. Human cognition is susceptible to distortion, and social structures can amplify that susceptibility. The preservation of truth, therefore, is not guaranteed. It depends on the maintenance of conditions that allow for its recognition. These conditions are neither purely individual nor purely institutional. They arise from the interaction between personal discipline and collective norms. Individuals must strive for clarity and honesty, but they must also operate within environments that support these efforts. When institutions promote distortion, whether through propaganda, censorship, or ideological enforcement, the burden on individuals increases, often to unsustainable levels. The interplay between individual agency and structural influence becomes a central concern. Orwell resists both extremes: the idea that individuals are fully autonomous thinkers unaffected by context, and the idea that they are entirely determined by external forces. Instead, he presents a model in which agency exists within constraint, where resistance is possible but never effortless. This nuanced position reflects a broader commitment to realism. Orwell avoids abstract idealizations, focusing instead on the practical conditions under which thought and language operate. His philosophy is grounded in the recognition that human beings are fallible, that systems of power are pervasive, and that clarity must be actively maintained rather than assumed. In this sense, his work functions as both analysis and warning. It identifies the mechanisms through which language can be corrupted and thought constrained, while also emphasizing the importance of resisting these processes. The stakes are not merely intellectual but existential. The capacity to understand reality, to communicate meaningfully, and to maintain a coherent sense of truth. From this starting point, his philosophy expands into a broader examination of power, control, and the structure of social reality, where the manipulation of language becomes one element within a larger system of domination and resistance. The philosophical trajectory associated with George Orwell extends beyond language into a deeper investigation of how political systems attempt to restructure reality itself. If part I established that language shapes thought, the next step in Orwell's analysis is the recognition that power seeks not merely to influence interpretation, but to regulate the conditions under which reality is recognized. In this framework, political authority evolves from traditional forms of governance, law, administration, coercion, into something more comprehensive, a system capable of shaping perception at scale. Control becomes epistemic as well as institutional. The central objective is no longer only obedience, but agreement about what counts as real. This shift introduces the concept often referred to as reality management. The governing apparatus attempts to align public understanding with its own narratives, not simply through persuasion, but through structural dominance over information channels. News, education, historical records, and public discourse become sites where reality is continuously curated. The significance of this process lies in its cumulative effect. A single distortion may be identifiable, but when distortions accumulate across multiple domains, language, history, media, collective memory, the capacity to distinguish truth from fabrication weakens. Over time, epistemic disorientation emerges. Individuals may sense inconsistencies, yet lack the stable reference points needed to challenge them. Orwell's philosophical insight here is that authoritarian systems do not rely solely on suppressing truth. They often aim to overwhelm it with competing narratives. When multiple versions of reality circulate simultaneously, certainty becomes difficult to sustain. People may retreat into conformity not because they fully believe official accounts, but because the effort required to maintain independent judgment becomes exhausting. This condition can be described as cognitive fatigue induced by informational instability. Instead of enforcing belief through constant violence, power exploits the limits of human attention and resilience. If the environment is sufficiently confusing, many individuals will default to the most socially reinforced narrative simply to preserve psychological stability. An important element of this mechanism involves the manipulation of historical continuity. Orwell repeatedly emphasizes that control over the past enables control over the present. If records can be altered, removed, or reinterpreted without resistance, then the standards by which current claims are evaluated become unstable. The past ceases to function as a constraint on power. History, within this philosophical structure, is not merely a record of events but a framework of orientation. It provides reference points that allow societies to judge claims, measure change, and identify patterns of behavior. When that framework is destabilized, collective reasoning becomes vulnerable to manipulation. However, Orwell's analysis is not limited to institutional control. He also identifies a psychological dimension that is equally important. Individuals are capable of internalizing contradictions when social pressure or ideological commitment is sufficiently strong. The human mind, in other words, possesses a capacity for adaptive rationalization, the ability to reconcile incompatible beliefs by adjusting interpretation rather than abandoning the belief itself. This capacity introduces a critical philosophical problem. How can truth survive in an environment where individuals can be persuaded to reinterpret evidence rather than revise conclusions? Orwell's answer lies in recognizing that truth depends on more than isolated facts. It requires a shared commitment to reality as a standard. Without such a commitment, facts alone are insufficient. Evidence can always be reframed, dismissed, or absorbed into alternative narratives. The survival of truth, therefore, depends on social norms that prioritize verification, consistency, and openness to correction. When these norms weaken, epistemic fragmentation increases. Fragmentation has several consequences. First, it reduces the ability of societies to coordinate collective action based on accurate understanding. Second, it increases susceptibility to manipulation, since different groups may operate within entirely different interpretive frameworks. Third, it creates conditions in which power can selectively reinforce whichever narrative serves its interests at a given moment. Orwell recognizes that this environment does not necessarily produce universal belief in official claims. Instead, it often produces resigned compliance, a state in which individuals no longer attempt to resolve contradictions because they perceive the effort as futile. In such conditions, truth loses practical influence even if it remains conceptually intact. The philosophical significance of this observation lies in its challenge to classical assumptions about rational discourse. Traditional models assume that exposure to evidence leads, over time, to convergence on truth. Orwell's analysis suggests that this process can be disrupted if the informational environment is systematically destabilized. In effect, the pathway from evidence to belief becomes obstructed. The mechanisms that normally facilitate correction, debate, documentation, institutional accountability, are weakened or redirected. Under these circumstances, truth requires not only evidence but structural protection. Structural protection can take many forms: independent institutions, transparent communication channels, preservation of historical records, and cultural norms that value accuracy over convenience. Orwell's philosophical outlook implicitly highlights the importance of these elements, even though he often presents them through narrative rather than formal theory. Another dimension of his thought concerns the relationship between fear and epistemology. When individuals fear social or political consequences for expressing certain interpretations, they may adjust their beliefs publicly or privately. Over time, this adjustment can alter internal convictions as well. Repeated exposure to enforced narratives can gradually reshape what individuals consider plausible. This process reveals that belief is not purely cognitive, it is also social. People evaluate claims partly through the reactions of others. When a particular interpretation becomes dominant within a community, dissent may appear irrational or dangerous even if it is well supported by evidence. The structure of social incentives, therefore, plays a crucial role in determining which beliefs persist. Orwell's philosophy thus integrates several levels of analysis: linguistic, psychological, institutional, and epistemic. Each level contributes to the broader question of how societies maintain or lose their connection to reality. The manipulation of language initiates distortion. The restructuring of information systems amplifies it. Social pressures reinforce it, and cognitive adaptation allows it to persist. Within this layered system, the concept of objective reality occupies a central position. Orwell defends the idea that reality exists independently of interpretation, yet he acknowledges that access to it is mediated through social processes. This creates a tension. Truth is stable, but the pathways to recognizing it are vulnerable. This tension leads to a philosophical stance that can be described as defensive realism. Orwell affirms the existence of objective truth, while simultaneously emphasizing the need to actively defend the conditions under which truth can be recognized. Reality does not require belief to exist, but societies require mechanisms to align belief with reality. The breakdown of these mechanisms leads to a peculiar condition: a world in which facts persist but lose influence over collective decision-making. In such a world, political power can operate with reduced constraint, since its claims are evaluated within an environment already saturated with uncertainty. Importantly, Orwell does not treat this outcome as inevitable. His work consistently implies that awareness of these mechanisms can itself function as a form of resistance. By identifying how reality is manipulated, individuals and societies gain the capacity to restore some degree of epistemic stability. This restoration is not simple. It requires rebuilding trust in information systems, reinforcing norms of accuracy, and maintaining spaces where claims can be evaluated without coercion. It also requires individuals willing to maintain intellectual independence even under pressure. From this point, Orwell's philosophical inquiry expands further into the ethical and existential dimensions of political life. How individuals navigate environments where truth is contested, how integrity can persist under systemic pressure, and how power interacts with the human desire for stability, belonging, and certainty. The philosophical trajectory of George Orwell deepens further when one examines how systems of power extend beyond external control into the internal architecture of belief and value. If earlier analysis focused on language and reality, the next layer concerns the transformation of moral judgment itself, how individuals come to accept, justify, and even defend conditions that contradict their own intuitive sense of truth. At this stage, power no longer operates primarily through coercion or even informational control, but through ideological internalization. Ideology, in Orwell's framework, is not merely a doctrine imposed from above. It is a structure that reorganizes perception from within. It provides interpretive templates that shape how individuals evaluate events, actions, and even their own thoughts. One of the most striking consequences of this internalization is what can be described as moral inversion. Actions that would ordinarily be recognized as unjust, contradictory, or harmful are reinterpreted as necessary, justified, or even virtuous within the ideological framework. The criteria for judgment are not eliminated but reconfigured. What changes is not the existence of morality, but its orientation. This inversion does not occur instantaneously. It is the result of gradual exposure to narratives that normalize contradiction. Repetition plays a critical role. Statements that initially appear implausible become familiar, and familiarity reduces resistance. Over time, the boundary between genuine conviction and adaptive acceptance begins to blur. Orwell's analysis suggests that this process is sustained by a form of cognitive compartmentalization. Individuals learn to hold conflicting ideas in separate domains, preventing direct confrontation between them. This compartmentalization allows the mind to maintain functional coherence even when its contents are logically inconsistent. The result is not outright confusion, but a managed form of contradiction. This managed contradiction becomes a mechanism of stability. Rather than destabilizing belief, it allows individuals to navigate environments where coherence is systematically undermined. The ability to tolerate inconsistency becomes adaptive, enabling individuals to function within systems that would otherwise be psychologically untenable. However, this adaptation comes at a cost. The capacity for critical reflection is weakened when contradictions are no longer experienced as problems requiring resolution. If inconsistency becomes normalized, the impulse to question diminishes. Thought shifts from analysis to alignment, from inquiry to reinforcement. This shift is closely tied to the role of social conformity. Human beings are not isolated reasoning agents. They are embedded within communities whose norms influence their judgments. When a particular interpretation becomes dominant within a group, deviation from it carries social risk. Over time, the desire for acceptance can outweigh the commitment to independent evaluation. Orwell highlights that conformity does not always require explicit enforcement. It can arise through subtle pressures, expectations, incentives, patterns of approval and disapproval that guide behavior without overt coercion. These pressures shape not only what individuals express, but what they come to believe. Belief, in this context, becomes socially mediated. It is influenced by the perceived consensus of the surrounding environment. When that environment is controlled or heavily structured, the range of acceptable interpretations narrows, and alternative perspectives become increasingly difficult to sustain. This narrowing has implications for the concept of intellectual integrity. Integrity requires the ability to maintain consistency between one's observations, reasoning, and conclusions. In environments where contradiction is normalized and conformity is incentivized, maintaining such consistency becomes challenging. The effort required to do so may isolate the individual from the broader social context. Isolation, in turn, can reinforce conformity. If dissent leads to marginalization, individuals may adjust their beliefs to preserve social connection. This adjustment is not always conscious. It can occur gradually, through small shifts in interpretation that accumulate over time. Orwell's philosophical contribution lies in recognizing that power operates most effectively when it becomes internal. External enforcement is costly and visible. Internalized control is efficient and largely self-sustaining. When individuals adopt the frameworks that justify their own subordination, the need for overt coercion diminishes. This internalization extends to the perception of authority itself. Authority is no longer experienced solely as an external force, but as a source of epistemic guidance. Individuals may come to trust institutional narratives over their own observations, especially when those narratives are reinforced by social consensus. The result is a reconfiguration of the relationship between experience and interpretation. Instead of using experience to evaluate claims, individuals may reinterpret their experiences to align with accepted narratives. This reversal represents a profound shift in epistemological orientation, one in which interpretation precedes observation. Such a shift has far-reaching consequences. It alters how evidence is processed, how contradictions are handled, and how beliefs are updated. The standard model of reasoning, where evidence informs belief, is replaced by a model in which belief shapes the interpretation of evidence. This reversal contributes to the persistence of ideological systems even in the face of disconfirming information. Contradictions do not necessarily lead to revision. They can be absorbed, reinterpreted, or dismissed. The system becomes resilient not because it is consistent, but because it is flexible in its handling of inconsistency. Orwell's analysis also addresses the emotional dimension of this process. Ideological systems often provide a sense of certainty, belonging, and purpose. These emotional benefits can reinforce adherence, making it more difficult to disengage even when inconsistencies are recognized. The cost of abandoning the framework may include not only intellectual adjustment, but social and psychological disruption. This interplay between cognition and emotion underscores the complexity of ideological commitment. Beliefs are not held in isolation. They are embedded within networks of identity, affiliation, and meaning. Challenging them requires more than presenting counter-evidence. It involves reconfiguring these broader networks. Within this context, resistance takes on a different character. It is not merely a matter of identifying falsehoods, but of maintaining cognitive independence in the face of systemic pressure. This independence involves the capacity to tolerate uncertainty, to question dominant narratives, and to sustain critical reflection even when it is socially costly. Orwell does not present this capacity as easily attainable. He recognizes the structural forces that work against it and the psychological demands it imposes. Yet he treats it as essential for preserving any meaningful connection to truth. The preservation of this connection depends on the maintenance of certain internal standards, consistency, attention to evidence, and a willingness to revise beliefs when warranted. These standards function as counterweights to the pressures of ideology, providing a basis for evaluating claims independently of their social reinforcement. At the same time, Orwell's philosophy acknowledges that individual resistance is not sufficient on its own. Without supportive environments, spaces where critical inquiry is possible and dissent is tolerated, the burden on individuals becomes overwhelming. The health of a society's epistemic and moral framework thus depends on both personal and institutional factors. This dual dependence reinforces the idea that freedom is not solely a political condition, but an epistemic one. It involves the capacity to think clearly, to evaluate claims critically, and to maintain coherence in one's understanding of the world. When these capacities are undermined, political freedom becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. From this point, the philosophical analysis extends into questions of human nature, autonomy, and the limits of resistance. How far individuals can maintain independence within systems designed to shape their perceptions, and what remains of truth, identity, and agency under sustained conditions of ideological control. The philosophical arc of George Orwell reaches a critical threshold when it turns toward the question of individual autonomy under conditions of systemic pressure. If earlier analysis demonstrated how language, reality, and morality can be reshaped, the next problem becomes unavoidable. To what extent can the individual remain independent when the surrounding environment is structured to absorb, redirect, or neutralize dissent? Autonomy, in this context, cannot be understood as absolute independence. Orwell's framework makes clear that individuals are always embedded within networks of language, social norms, and institutional forces. The question is not whether one can exist outside these structures, but whether one can maintain a degree of internal separation, a space in which thought is not fully determined by external influence. This internal separation is fragile. It depends on the ability to preserve a distinction between what is presented and what is accepted, between perception and endorsement. Under ordinary conditions, this distinction may seem trivial. Under sustained ideological pressure, it becomes a central site of struggle. The individual must continually decide whether to align with dominant narratives or to retain a degree of skepticism. Orwell's analysis suggests that this decision is rarely binary. Instead, it unfolds along a spectrum of partial compliance and partial resistance. Individuals may outwardly conform while privately doubting, or they may accept certain elements of a system while rejecting others. This fragmentation reflects the difficulty of maintaining complete independence within a highly structured environment. The existence of such fragmentation raises an important question. Does partial resistance meaningfully preserve autonomy, or does it ultimately reinforce the system it seeks to resist? Orwell's perspective implies that even limited forms of independence can have significance, but they are inherently unstable. Without reinforcement, either internal or external, they risk erosion over time. Erosion occurs through repeated exposure and adaptation. As individuals navigate environments that reward conformity and penalize dissent, the effort required to sustain independent judgment increases. Over time, the cognitive and emotional cost may lead to gradual alignment with dominant frameworks, not through explicit conversion, but through incremental adjustment. This process highlights a key limitation of individual resistance. It is resource-dependent. Maintaining critical distance requires attention, energy, and often social support. In the absence of these resources, autonomy becomes difficult to sustain. The system does not need to eliminate resistance directly. It can allow it to dissipate through fatigue. Orwell's philosophical insight here is that power operates not only by force, but by shaping the conditions under which effort is required. If resistance becomes sufficiently costly, many individuals will abandon it, not because they are convinced, but because they are exhausted. This introduces a pragmatic dimension to the analysis of freedom. The capacity to resist depends not only on conviction but on sustainability. Sustainability, in turn, is linked to the presence of shared frameworks of dissent. When individuals can connect with others who maintain similar standards of truth and reasoning, the burden of resistance is distributed. Collective support reinforces individual autonomy, making it more resilient against external pressures. However, systems of control often seek to disrupt such connections. By fragmenting communication, isolating dissenting voices, or introducing uncertainty about who shares which beliefs, they reduce the likelihood of coordinated resistance. Isolation amplifies vulnerability, as individuals may come to perceive themselves as alone in their skepticism. This perception has significant psychological effects. Doubt, when unsupported, can transform into self-doubt. Individuals may question not only external claims but their own capacity to evaluate them. Over time, this can lead to a withdrawal from critical engagement altogether, a retreat into passive acceptance or disengagement. Orwell's analysis thus reveals that autonomy is not simply a matter of internal conviction, but of relational context. The individual's ability to think independently is influenced by the presence or absence of reinforcing structures. Autonomy is both personal and collective, both cognitive and social. Within this relational framework, the concept of integrity acquires a specific meaning. It is not merely adherence to a set of beliefs, but the maintenance of coherence between perception, judgment, and expression. Integrity requires that one's interpretation of reality remains anchored in observation and reasoning, even when external pressures encourage deviation. Maintaining such coherence becomes increasingly difficult in environments where expression is constrained. When individuals cannot articulate their observations openly, the link between thought and communication weakens. Over time, this can affect thought itself, as unexpressed ideas lose clarity and force. Language, once again, plays a central role. The ability to name and describe reality supports the ability to recognize it. This connection between expression and cognition reinforces Orwell's earlier emphasis on linguistic clarity. Without the means to articulate distinctions, the capacity to perceive them may diminish. Autonomy, therefore, depends in part on the preservation of expressive tools that allow for precise and honest communication. Yet even with such tools, the limits of individual resistance remain evident. There are conditions under which external pressure becomes overwhelming, where the combined forces of social conformity, institutional control, and cognitive strain exceed the individual's capacity to maintain independence. Orwell does not deny this possibility. In fact, his work often explores it directly. This acknowledgement introduces a sober dimension into his philosophy. Resistance is possible but not guaranteed. Autonomy can be preserved, but it can also be compromised. The outcome depends on a complex interplay of factors: personal resilience, social context, institutional structure, that cannot be fully controlled by any single agent. At the same time, the recognition of limits does not negate the value of resistance. Even when autonomy cannot be fully sustained, partial efforts can preserve fragments of truth, maintain alternative perspectives, and create the conditions for future rearticulation. Resistance, in this sense, is not only about immediate success, but about continuity of critical awareness. This continuity becomes especially important when considering the long-term dynamics of power. Systems that appear stable may contain internal tensions that eventually lead to change. The persistence of independent thought, even in constrained forms, contributes to the possibility of such change by preserving the conceptual resources needed to reinterpret and reorganize reality. Orwell's philosophical position thus balances realism with a restrained form of optimism. He does not assume that truth will inevitably prevail, but he also does not treat its preservation as futile. Instead, he emphasizes the importance of maintaining the conditions under which truth can be recognized and articulated, even when those conditions are under pressure. The individual within this framework occupies a paradoxical position. On one hand, they are limited, vulnerable, and subject to forces beyond their control. On the other, they are a necessary site of resistance, the point at which external structures encounter internal evaluation. Autonomy may be constrained, but it is not entirely eliminated. This paradox leads to a broader reflection on the nature of agency. Agency is not absolute freedom, but the capacity to act within constraints, to make distinctions, to evaluate claims, and to maintain a degree of coherence in one's understanding. It is a dynamic property, fluctuating with circumstances rather than fixed in advance. From this perspective, the preservation of agency becomes a central philosophical and practical concern. It requires attention not only to external conditions, but to internal practices, habits of thought, standards of reasoning, and commitments to clarity. These practices do not guarantee autonomy, but they increase its resilience. As the analysis extends further, the focus shifts toward the structural conditions that either support or undermine these practices. The design of institutions, the organization of information, and the broader cultural environment in which individuals operate. The philosophical analysis associated with George Orwell expands decisively when attention shifts from the individual to the systems that shape collective perception at scale. If autonomy depends partly on internal discipline, it depends equally on the external environment within which cognition operates. This environment is structured by institutions, media, education, governance, whose organization determines how information is produced, distributed, and legitimized. Within this structural context, belief is no longer merely a personal conclusion derived from evidence. It becomes the outcome of information architectures. These architectures regulate visibility, what is seen, what is repeated, what is omitted. They influence not only which facts are available, but which facts appear relevant, credible, or urgent. The critical insight here is that control over information does not require absolute censorship. It can operate through selective amplification and strategic omission. By emphasizing certain narratives while minimizing others, institutions shape the perceived landscape of reality. Individuals may believe they are forming independent judgments, yet those judgments are constrained by the boundaries of what is made visible. This process introduces a structural asymmetry. Those who control the channels of communication possess disproportionate influence over collective understanding. Their decisions, what to publish, how to frame events, which interpretations to prioritize, become embedded in the epistemic environment. Over time, these decisions accumulate, producing a patterned representation of reality that may diverge significantly from underlying conditions. Orwell's philosophical contribution lies in recognizing that such divergence does not always appear as falsehood. It often manifests as systematic distortion within a framework of apparent plausibility. Information may be factually accurate at a micro level while misleading at a macro level due to context, framing, or omission. The result is a form of truth that is technically correct, yet substantively incomplete. This distinction between factual accuracy and structural truth is essential. It reveals that epistemic integrity depends not only on the correctness of individual statements, but on the coherence of the overall informational system. A society can possess many true statements while lacking an accurate understanding of reality if those statements are arranged in a way that obscures critical relations. The role of media within this framework becomes central. Media systems function as intermediaries between events and perception. They translate occurrences into narratives, selecting which aspects to highlight and which to background. This translation is not neutral. It reflects institutional priorities, economic incentives, and ideological orientations. Economic incentives, in particular, introduce a layer of complexity. Media organizations operate within competitive environments where attention is a scarce resource. The need to attract and retain audiences can shape content in ways that prioritize engagement over accuracy. Sensationalism, simplification, and emotional framing may become prevalent, not necessarily as deliberate manipulation, but as adaptive responses to structural pressures. This adaptation, however, has epistemic consequences. When information is consistently presented in ways that maximize attention rather than understanding, cognitive patterns adjust accordingly. Audiences may become accustomed to simplified narratives, reducing their tolerance for complexity and nuance. Over time, this can erode the capacity for sustained critical analysis. Education systems also play a significant role in this process. They shape the foundational frameworks through which individuals interpret information. The methods by which knowledge is taught, whether they emphasize critical inquiry or rote acceptance, affect how individuals engage with competing claims. An education system that prioritizes conformity over analysis can reinforce the very dynamics Orwell critiques. At the institutional level, the interaction between media and education creates a feedback loop. Education influences how individuals consume media. Media influences what is considered relevant knowledge. Together, they contribute to the formation of collective epistemic habits, patterns of attention, interpretation, and evaluation that define how a society processes information. These habits are not fixed. They can evolve in response to technological, cultural, and political changes. The introduction of new communication technologies, for example, alters the speed and scale at which information circulates. This can increase access to diverse perspectives, but it can also amplify fragmentation, creating environments where multiple, incompatible narratives coexist. Fragmentation introduces both opportunities and risks. On one hand, it reduces the ability of any single authority to monopolize information. On the other, it complicates the task of establishing shared standards of truth. When individuals operate within different informational ecosystems, consensus becomes difficult to achieve. The result is a landscape characterized by parallel realities, each internally coherent but externally incompatible. Orwell's philosophical framework suggests that such fragmentation can be exploited by power structures. By encouraging division and amplifying conflicting narratives, it becomes possible to weaken collective resistance. If no shared reality exists, coordinated action becomes difficult, and authority faces fewer constraints. This dynamic highlights the importance of epistemic coordination, the ability of a society to maintain a common framework for evaluating claims. Coordination does not require uniformity of opinion, but it does require agreement on basic standards. What counts as evidence, how contradictions are addressed, and how claims are verified. Without these standards, discourse devolves into competition between unconnected perspectives. The maintenance of such standards depends on institutional integrity. Institutions must operate with a degree of independence and accountability to sustain trust. When institutions become instruments of particular interests, their credibility declines, and the epistemic environment becomes unstable. Trust, once eroded, is difficult to rebuild, and its absence further complicates the process of establishing shared understanding. Orwell's analysis implicitly underscores the fragility of this trust. It is not guaranteed by formal structures alone. It requires consistent alignment between institutional claims and observable reality. Discrepancies, if frequent or severe, can lead to skepticism that extends beyond specific issues to the system as a whole. This generalized skepticism can produce a paradoxical effect. While it may reduce susceptibility to certain forms of manipulation, it can also increase vulnerability to others. In the absence of trusted sources, individuals may rely on alternative narratives that lack verification. The collapse of trust does not eliminate belief, it redistributes it across less stable foundations. The redistribution of belief further complicates the landscape of power. Authority becomes diffuse, operating through networks rather than centralized structures. Influence is exercised through the ability to shape narratives, mobilize attention, and align groups around shared interpretations. The mechanisms identified by Orwell, language manipulation, reality distortion, ideological internalization, remain operative, but they manifest in more decentralized forms. Within this evolving environment, the preservation of epistemic integrity requires adaptation. Traditional safeguards, centralized media, standardized education, may no longer suffice. New forms of coordination, verification, and critical engagement must emerge to address the increased complexity of the informational landscape. Orwell's philosophical orientation provides a framework for understanding these challenges. By emphasizing the interdependence of language, power, and knowledge, it highlights the need for vigilance at multiple levels. Individuals must cultivate clarity and independence. Institutions must maintain transparency and accountability. Societies must develop mechanisms for sustaining shared standards of truth. This multi-level approach reflects the systemic nature of the problem. No single intervention can secure epistemic stability. It requires the alignment of practices across domains, each reinforcing the others. The failure of any one component, language, institutions, or individual reasoning, can undermine the entire structure. As the analysis extends further, the focus moves toward the deeper implications of these dynamics for human identity, meaning, and the long-term viability of truth in environments characterized by persistent instability and structural pressure. The philosophical trajectory of George Orwell culminates, at a deeper level, in an inquiry into how systems of power reshape not only belief, but the structure of personal identity itself. If language shapes thought, and institutions shape belief, then the next layer concerns the self as a constructed continuity, one that depends on memory, narrative, and coherence across time. Identity in this framework is not a fixed essence but a temporal organization of experience. It emerges through the integration of past events, present interpretations, and anticipated futures into a relatively stable narrative. This narrative provides orientation. It allows individuals to understand who they are, what they have experienced, and how they relate to the world. Orwell's analysis reveals that this narrative is vulnerable when the integrity of memory is compromised. Memory is not merely a repository of facts. It is a structuring function that links events into meaningful sequences. When external systems interfere with this function, by altering records, promoting false accounts, or introducing persistent contradictions, the coherence of personal identity becomes unstable. This instability arises because identity depends on consistency between internal recollection and external confirmation. Individuals rely, at least in part, on shared references to validate their memories. When those references are systematically altered or denied, a gap emerges between what one recalls and what is publicly acknowledged. Sustaining confidence in one's own memory under such conditions becomes increasingly difficult. The erosion of this confidence has profound consequences. If individuals begin to doubt their own recollections, their ability to maintain a coherent sense of self weakens. Identity becomes fragmented, subject to reinterpretation based on external narratives. The individual no longer functions as a stable point of reference, but as a site of ongoing reconstruction. This reconstruction is not neutral. It tends to align with dominant frameworks, particularly when those frameworks are reinforced by institutional authority and social consensus. Over time, the individual's narrative may shift to accommodate external versions of events, even when those versions contradict prior experience. The self becomes adaptive to power, reconfiguring itself to maintain alignment with the surrounding environment. Orwell's philosophical insight here is that control over memory constitutes a deeper form of power than control over immediate perception. While perception governs how events are interpreted in the present, memory governs how those events are integrated into the broader structure of identity. By influencing memory, power extends its reach across time, reshaping both past and present simultaneously. This temporal dimension introduces a new form of epistemic vulnerability. Truth is no longer threatened only in the present moment. It is threatened retroactively. Events that have already occurred can be reinterpreted, reframed, or effectively replaced within the collective narrative. The past, instead of serving as a constraint, becomes a malleable resource. The malleability of the past disrupts the continuity required for stable identity. Without reliable reference points, individuals may struggle to maintain a consistent narrative of their own lives. This struggle can lead to a form of existential disorientation, where the boundaries between memory, interpretation, and imposed narrative become blurred. Such disorientation does not necessarily produce overt confusion. It can manifest as a subtle weakening of conviction, a reduced confidence in one's own understanding of events. Individuals may continue to function, but with a diminished sense of certainty about their own experiences. This condition makes them more susceptible to external influence, as they rely increasingly on authoritative narratives to fill gaps in their understanding. The relationship between identity and truth thus becomes reciprocal. A stable sense of self supports the recognition of truth. A stable recognition of truth supports the coherence of the self. When one is undermined, the other is affected. Orwell's framework highlights how systems of power can exploit this reciprocity, targeting both dimensions simultaneously. At the same time, the persistence of identity requires mechanisms of resistance. One such mechanism is the preservation of private memory, the effort to maintain internal records that remain independent of external distortion. This preservation is not merely a cognitive act, but a form of epistemic commitment, a refusal to relinquish one's own experience as a source of knowledge. However, private memory alone may not suffice. Without external reinforcement, it remains vulnerable to doubt and reinterpretation. The integration of memory into shared narratives, through communication, documentation, and collective acknowledgement, provides additional stability. Identity, therefore, is both individual and relational, sustained through interaction as well as introspection. This relational dimension introduces the importance of testimony. When individuals share their experiences and find them corroborated by others, their confidence in those experiences is reinforced. Testimony functions as a bridge between private memory and public reality, helping to align personal narratives with collective understanding. In environments where testimony is suppressed or discredited, this bridge weakens. Individuals may retain memories but lack the means to validate them. The resulting isolation amplifies vulnerability, making it easier for external narratives to reshape internal understanding. The erosion of testimony thus contributes directly to the erosion of identity. Orwell's philosophical perspective suggests that maintaining identity under such conditions requires not only memory but interpretive resilience, the capacity to evaluate competing narratives and to maintain coherence in one's understanding despite external pressure. This resilience depends on cognitive discipline, but also on access to alternative frameworks that allow for independent interpretation. The role of narrative becomes central here. Identity is constructed through stories, accounts that organize events into meaningful sequences. When dominant narratives are distorted, alternative narratives become essential for preserving coherence. These alternatives need not be fully comprehensive. Even partial frameworks can provide anchors that prevent total disintegration. The existence of multiple narratives, however, introduces complexity. Individuals must navigate between competing accounts, assessing their plausibility and consistency. This process requires not only access to information, but the capacity to synthesize and evaluate. Without such capacity, the presence of alternatives may increase confusion rather than clarity. Orwell's analysis thus returns at a deeper level to the importance of cognitive integrity. The preservation of identity depends on the same principles that support the recognition of truth: clarity, consistency, and critical evaluation. These principles operate across domains, linking language, belief, memory, and selfhood into a unified framework. Within this framework, the self is neither entirely autonomous nor entirely determined. It is shaped by external forces but retains a degree of internal structure that can resist complete assimilation. This resistance is not absolute. It can weaken or fail under sustained pressure. Yet its persistence, even in limited forms, provides a basis for continuity. Continuity, in this sense, is not the absence of change but the maintenance of structural coherence through change. Identity evolves, but it does not dissolve entirely unless the conditions that support coherence are removed. Orwell's philosophy highlights how those conditions can be undermined, but also how they might be preserved. As the analysis extends further, attention turns toward the broader implications of these dynamics for meaning, purpose, and the possibility of maintaining a stable orientation within a world where truth, memory, and identity are all subject to ongoing reconstruction. The philosophical trajectory associated with George Orwell reaches a further level of abstraction when it confronts the question of meaning under conditions where truth, memory, and identity are destabilized. If the previous analysis has shown how reality can be distorted and the self reconfigured, the next issue concerns whether coherent meaning can persist in such an environment, or whether these processes lead toward a form of functional nihilism. Meaning in this framework is not an isolated property, but an emergent structure arising from the alignment of three elements: reliable perception, stable memory, and coherent interpretation. When these elements reinforce one another, individuals can situate themselves within a world that appears intelligible and continuous. Actions acquire purpose because they are connected to a broader understanding of reality. However, when these elements are systematically disrupted, meaning begins to fragment. If perception is unreliable, memory unstable, and interpretation externally shaped, then the connections that sustain meaning weaken. Events no longer form a coherent narrative. They become isolated occurrences without clear relation to one another. This fragmentation can give rise to a condition that resembles nihilism, not necessarily the explicit denial of meaning, but the inability to sustain it in practice. Orwell's philosophical perspective suggests that this condition is not merely a byproduct of abstract doubt, but a consequence of structural interference with epistemic processes. When systems of power destabilize truth and coherence, they indirectly affect the individual's capacity to construct meaningful narratives. The result is not always despair. It may manifest as disengagement, resignation, or passive adaptation. This adaptation often takes the form of localized meaning. Individuals may abandon attempts to maintain a comprehensive understanding of reality and instead focus on immediate practical concerns. Meaning becomes situational rather than global, confined to specific contexts where coherence can still be maintained. While this allows for functional continuity, it limits the scope of understanding and reduces the capacity for long-term orientation. The shift toward localized meaning introduces a form of existential contraction. The range of concerns narrows and the horizon of interpretation shrinks. Individuals may continue to act, decide, and interact, but their actions are less integrated into a larger framework of purpose. The broader questions about truth, justice, or historical continuity become increasingly difficult to address. Orwell's analysis implies that this contraction is not neutral. It benefits systems that rely on reduced critical engagement. When individuals focus narrowly on immediate concerns, they are less likely to question broader structures of power. The erosion of comprehensive meaning thus contributes indirectly to the stability of those structures. At the same time, the persistence of even localized meaning indicates that the human drive for coherence is resilient. Individuals continue to seek patterns, connections, and explanations, even in constrained environments. This drive provides a basis for the potential reconstruction of broader frameworks, should conditions allow. The reconstruction of meaning requires the reestablishment of connections between perception, memory, and interpretation. It involves restoring confidence in observation, stabilizing reference points from the past, and developing interpretive frameworks that can integrate diverse experiences. This process is gradual and contingent, dependent on both individual effort and structural conditions. A key obstacle to reconstruction is the presence of contradictory narratives that cannot be easily reconciled. When multiple frameworks offer incompatible interpretations of reality, individuals must navigate between them without a clear criterion for resolution. This situation can lead to paralysis or selective alignment, where individuals adopt elements of different narratives without achieving full coherence. Orwell's philosophical orientation does not offer a simple solution to this problem. Instead, it emphasizes the importance of maintaining standards of evaluation, criteria that can be applied across contexts to assess the plausibility and consistency of claims. These standards function as anchors, providing a basis for comparison even when complete certainty is unattainable. Such standards include attention to evidence, logical consistency, and correspondence with observable reality. While these criteria cannot eliminate ambiguity, they can reduce arbitrariness. They allow individuals to differentiate between interpretations that are more or less adequate, even in complex environments. The application of these standards requires sustained cognitive effort. It involves resisting the tendency towards simplification and engaging with complexity without collapsing into confusion. This effort is demanding, particularly in environments that reward quick judgments and reinforce simplified narratives. Orwell's analysis thus highlights a tension between cognitive economy and epistemic rigor. Human cognition tends toward efficiency, favoring shortcuts and heuristics. Epistemic rigor, by contrast, requires deliberate analysis and the willingness to hold unresolved questions. Systems of power can exploit this tension by promoting conditions in which shortcuts become dominant. The preservation of meaning, therefore, depends on maintaining a balance between these tendencies. Individuals must manage cognitive resources while preserving the capacity for critical evaluation. This balance is not fixed. It must be continually adjusted in response to changing conditions. Another dimension of meaning concerns the role of values. Even in environments where factual truth is contested, individuals may retain commitments to certain principles: fairness, honesty, consistency. These values can provide a form of orientation independent of specific narratives, guiding evaluation and action even when information is uncertain. However, values themselves can be subject to reinterpretation under ideological pressure. As seen in earlier analysis, moral inversion can reshape what is considered acceptable or desirable. The stability of values thus depends on their integration with reliable frameworks of understanding. When those frameworks are disrupted, values may lose their anchoring function. Despite these challenges, Orwell's philosophy suggests that meaning is not entirely eliminable. It can be suppressed, fragmented, or redirected, but the underlying human orientation toward coherence persists. This persistence creates the possibility of rearticulation, of reconstructing frameworks that restore connections between experience and interpretation. Rearticulation does not imply a return to a previous state. It involves the development of new configurations that account for past distortions while establishing more stable conditions for understanding. This process requires both Arabic Alif, Arabic Lam, Arabic Noon, Arabic Half, Arabic Dal, critical examination, and synthesis, integrating insights from multiple perspectives into a coherent structure. Within this process, the role of narrative becomes central once again. Narratives provide the means by which disparate elements are connected into meaningful wholes. The challenge is to construct narratives that are both comprehensive and grounded, capable of accommodating complexity without sacrificing clarity. Orwell's philosophical contribution lies in identifying the conditions under which such narratives can emerge and persist. These conditions include linguistic precision, epistemic standards, institutional integrity, and the preservation of memory. When these elements align, the possibility of sustained meaning increases. As the analysis progresses, the focus turns toward the long-term implications of these dynamics, whether stable systems of truth and meaning can be maintained in environments characterized by persistent pressure, and what forms of equilibrium, if any, can emerge between power, knowledge, and human orientation. The philosophical trajectory of George Orwell reaches a further level of synthesis when examining whether a stable equilibrium between power and truth is achievable, or whether their relationship is inherently conflictual and perpetually unstable. The preceding analysis has established that language, institutions, identity, and meaning are all susceptible to distortion. The remaining question concerns whether these domains can be organized in such a way that truth retains functional influence over time. Equilibrium in this context cannot be understood as a fixed or permanent state. It is better conceived as a dynamic balance, continuously maintained through the interaction of competing forces. On one side lies the tendency of power to consolidate, simplify, and control. On the other lies the tendency of truth to resist simplification, to require complexity, and to demand alignment with reality. These tendencies are not mutually exclusive, but they are often in tension. Orwell's philosophical orientation suggests that this tension is structural rather than incidental. Power, by its nature, seeks stability and predictability. It benefits from environments in which uncertainty is minimized and narratives are controlled. Truth, by contrast, introduces variability. It may reveal contradictions, expose failures, or challenge established interpretations. As a result, truth can appear disruptive from the perspective of power. This structural tension implies that equilibrium, if it exists, must involve constraints on both sides. Power must be limited in its capacity to reshape reality without accountability, while truth must be integrated into systems in ways that allow for practical governance. Neither pure domination nor pure transparency is sustainable. Each requires the other to function within a stable framework. The mechanisms that support such equilibrium are institutional, cultural, and cognitive. Institutions provide formal constraints, rules, procedures, and checks that limit the concentration of authority. Cultural norms reinforce these constraints by establishing expectations about honesty, accountability, and evidence. Cognitive practices sustain them at the individual level through habits of critical thinking and attention to detail. However, each of these mechanisms is itself vulnerable. Institutions can be co-opted, norms can erode, and cognitive practices can weaken under pressure. The stability of the system, therefore, depends not on any single component, but on their mutual reinforcement. When one weakens, the others must compensate. When multiple components fail simultaneously, the equilibrium destabilizes. Destabilization does not necessarily result in immediate collapse. It often manifests as gradual drift, a progressive misalignment between representation and reality. This drift can persist for extended periods, especially if its effects are unevenly distributed or partially obscured. Over time, however, the accumulation of discrepancies may lead to systemic strain, as decisions based on distorted information produce unintended consequences. Orwell's framework implies that such strain can serve as a corrective mechanism, but only under certain conditions. For correction to occur, discrepancies must be recognized, communicated, and acted upon. Each step in this sequence is contingent. Recognition requires access to accurate information. Communication requires channels that allow for its dissemination, and action requires the capacity to respond without suppression. If any of these steps is blocked, the corrective process fails. Discrepancies may be recognized but not communicated, communicated but not acknowledged, or acknowledged but not addressed. In such cases, the system continues to operate under distorted assumptions, increasing the likelihood of further misalignment. The persistence of misalignment introduces a paradox. Systems that successfully suppress corrective feedback may appear stable in the short term, as dissent is minimized and narratives remain consistent. However, this apparent stability masks underlying fragility. Without feedback, errors accumulate, and the system's capacity to adapt diminishes. This fragility is not always visible from within the system. Participants may perceive continuity and coherence, even as the underlying structure becomes increasingly strained. The absence of visible conflict can be misinterpreted as evidence of stability, when it may instead indicate the suppression of necessary adjustment processes. Orwell's philosophical insight here is that true stability requires the capacity for self-correction, which in turn requires openness to truth. Systems that eliminate this openness in pursuit of control may achieve temporary coherence, but at the cost of long-term resilience. Stability, therefore, is not the absence of disruption, but the ability to incorporate it. The incorporation of disruption depends on maintaining spaces where contradiction can be articulated without immediate neutralization. These spaces, whether institutional, cultural, or intellectual, function as zones of reflection. They allow for the examination of discrepancies, the testing of interpretations, and the revision of assumptions. Such zones are inherently contested. They challenge established narratives and introduce uncertainty, making them potential targets for restriction. Yet their preservation is essential for maintaining equilibrium. Without them, the system loses its capacity to align representation with reality. At the level of the individual, this dynamic is mirrored in the capacity to tolerate uncertainty. Equilibrium requires not only external structures but internal dispositions. The willingness to engage with complexity, to revise beliefs, and to accept that understanding is provisional. These dispositions counteract the tendency toward rigid certainty, which can reinforce distortion. The relationship between certainty and control is central to Orwell's analysis. Systems of power often promote simplified, definitive narratives because they are easier to manage and communicate. Complexity, by contrast, introduces ambiguity and reduces predictability. The maintenance of equilibrium, therefore, involves resisting the reduction of complexity to simplistic formulations, even when such formulations are appealing. This resistance does not imply embracing ambiguity for its own sake. It involves distinguishing between necessary complexity, arising from the nature of reality, and unnecessary complication, arising from obfuscation or distortion. The challenge lies in maintaining clarity without oversimplification and nuance without confusion. Orwell's philosophical contribution provides a framework for navigating this challenge. By emphasizing the interplay between language, truth, and power, it highlights the need for continuous calibration. Concepts must be refined, narratives adjusted, and assumptions tested against evidence. Equilibrium is not achieved once but maintained through ongoing effort. This ongoing effort underscores the temporal dimension of the problem. The relationship between power and truth evolves over time, influenced by technological change, cultural shifts, and historical contingencies. Mechanisms that support equilibrium in one context may become insufficient in another, requiring adaptation. Adaptation, however, introduces new risks. Changes intended to improve resilience may create unintended vulnerabilities, particularly if they alter the balance between openness and control. The design of systems must therefore account for second-order effects, anticipating how adjustments may interact with existing structures. Orwell's analysis does not resolve these complexities but clarifies their structure. It shows that the preservation of truth within systems of power is not a static problem with a fixed solution, but a continuous process of negotiation. This process involves trade-offs, uncertainties, and the constant possibility of failure. Within this framework, the role of individuals and institutions converges. Both are required to sustain equilibrium, and both are subject to the same pressures that threaten it. The challenge is to align their functions in a way that reinforces rather than undermines the conditions for truth. As the inquiry extends further, attention turns toward the broader implications of this dynamic for the future. How evolving technologies, shifting forms of authority, and changing patterns of communication may alter the balance between power and truth, and what new forms of stability or instability may emerge from these transformations. The philosophical trajectory of George Orwell acquires renewed relevance when extended into the domain of technological mediation, where the mechanisms he identified, language distortion, reality management, and ideological internalization, are amplified by unprecedented speed, scale, and automation. The core structures remain consistent, but their operational dynamics change significantly under conditions of accelerated information flow. Technology alters not only how information is transmitted, but how it is selected, prioritized, and experienced. In earlier configurations, the production of narratives was relatively centralized. In technologically mediated environments, it becomes distributed across complex systems involving algorithms, networks, and user interactions. Control, therefore, shifts from overt direction to systemic modulation. This modulation operates through mechanisms that are often opaque to those affected by them. Algorithms determine visibility, shaping which information appears prominent and which remains peripheral. These processes are not neutral. They are structured by design choices, optimization criteria, and feedback loops that prioritize certain forms of content over others. The result is an environment in which attention itself becomes a managed resource. The management of attention introduces a new dimension to Orwell's analysis. If language shapes thought and institutions shape belief, then attention shapes the boundaries of awareness. What is not attended to effectively does not exist within the individual's operational reality. Control over attention thus becomes a form of indirect control over perception and interpretation. Acceleration intensifies this effect. The rapid turnover of information reduces the time available for reflection, increasing reliance on heuristic processing. Individuals are exposed to a continuous stream of content, each fragment competing for immediate engagement. Under such conditions, depth of analysis tends to decrease, while responsiveness and emotional reactivity increase. This shift has epistemic consequences. Complex issues that require sustained attention may be underrepresented or simplified, while content that can be quickly processed and shared gains prominence. Over time, this can reshape cognitive habits, reinforcing patterns of consumption that prioritize speed over accuracy and immediacy over coherence. Orwell's concern with simplification finds a new manifestation here. Simplified narratives are not only easier to control, they are also more compatible with accelerated environments. The convergence of structural incentives, technological and political, creates conditions in which reductive representations of reality proliferate. At the same time, technological systems introduce new forms of fragmentation. Individuals may encounter highly personalized streams of information, shaped by prior behavior and inferred preferences. This personalization can create epistemic segmentation, where different groups operate within distinct informational contexts, each reinforcing its own interpretations. Segmentation complicates the possibility of shared understanding. When individuals are exposed to different sets of information, their baseline assumptions diverge. Disagreement is no longer limited to interpretation. It extends to the underlying data itself. The coordination of belief becomes increasingly difficult, and the concept of a common reality weakens. Orwell's analysis of parallel narratives thus gains a new dimension. What was once a product of centralized control can now emerge from decentralized processes. Multiple realities coexist, each internally consistent but externally incompatible. The challenge is not only identifying distortion but navigating multiplicity without losing coherence. Within this multiplicity, authority becomes diffuse. Traditional sources of credibility, institutions, experts, official records, compete with alternative sources that may lack verification but possess high visibility. The criteria for trust shift, influenced by factors such as familiarity, repetition, and network reinforcement. This shift introduces a form of epistemic relativization, where the distinction between more and less reliable sources becomes blurred. Individuals may evaluate claims based on alignment with existing beliefs rather than independent verification. The process of belief formation becomes increasingly self-reinforcing, as exposure is filtered through prior preferences. Orwell's concept of ideological reinforcement finds a technological analog here. Systems that optimize for engagement may inadvertently strengthen existing biases, creating feedback loops that intensify commitment to particular narratives. These loops can operate without centralized coordination, emerging from the interaction between user behavior and algorithmic design. The absence of centralized control does not eliminate the possibility of manipulation. Instead, it transforms it. Influence can be exerted through the strategic introduction of content into these feedback loops, leveraging existing patterns to amplify specific messages. The result is a form of distributed influence, less visible but potentially more pervasive. This environment also affects the role of memory. Digital systems provide extensive storage and retrieval capabilities, but they also alter how memory is experienced. Information is often accessed on demand rather than retained internally, shifting reliance from personal recollection to external databases. While this can increase access, it may reduce the internal consolidation of knowledge. The externalization of memory introduces new vulnerabilities. If access to information is mediated by systems that can prioritize, filter, or modify content, then memory itself becomes subject to indirect control. The stability of knowledge depends not only on what is stored, but on how it is retrieved and presented. Orwell's concern with historical manipulation thus extends into the digital domain. The past may remain technically accessible, but its visibility and framing can be altered in ways that affect interpretation. The distinction between preservation and accessibility becomes critical. Information that exists but is difficult to find or contextualize has limited practical impact. The cumulative effect of these dynamics is a transformation of the epistemic environment. Truth remains a property of reality, but its accessibility is mediated by complex systems that can both enhance and hinder understanding. The challenge is no longer solely to protect truth from suppression, but to ensure that it remains discernible within a saturated informational field. Discernibility requires new forms of literacy. Individuals must navigate not only content but the structures that deliver it, understanding how algorithms function, how incentives shape information, and how biases can be reinforced. This meta-level awareness becomes a prerequisite for maintaining epistemic integrity. At the institutional level, the design of technological systems becomes a central concern. Decisions about transparency, accountability, and governance influence how information flows and how it is evaluated. The absence of clear standards can lead to environments where manipulation is difficult to detect and address. Orwell's philosophical framework does not prescribe specific technological solutions, but it provides criteria for evaluation. Systems should support clarity rather than obfuscation, enable verification rather than distortion, and facilitate coordination rather than fragmentation. These criteria can guide the development of structures that align with the preservation of truth. However, the implementation of such criteria involves trade-offs. Increased transparency may conflict with privacy. Greater regulation may limit flexibility. Efforts to reduce fragmentation may risk centralization. The balance between these considerations is context-dependent and subject to ongoing negotiation. The integration of technology into the broader dynamics of power and truth thus introduces a new layer of complexity. The fundamental issues identified by Orwell persist, but their expression is transformed by the scale and speed of contemporary systems. The preservation of epistemic stability requires adaptation at multiple levels, from individual cognition to institutional design. As the analysis continues, attention shifts toward the long-range implications of these transformations. How sustained exposure to accelerated, fragmented, and mediated environments reshapes human cognition itself, and whether the capacities required for critical thought can be maintained or reconstructed under such conditions. The philosophical trajectory associated with George Orwell reaches a further level of depth when examining how prolonged exposure to these conditions, linguistic distortion, informational overload, technological mediation, begins to reshape cognition itself. The question is no longer limited to what individuals think, but extends to how they think, and whether the cognitive structures required for independent reasoning can persist under sustained pressure. Cognition in this framework is not static. It adapts to the environments in which it operates. When those environments are stable and structured around coherent standards of truth, cognitive habits tend to reinforce clarity, consistency, and analytical depth. When environments become fragmented, accelerated, and saturated with competing signals, cognition adapts in different ways, prioritizing speed, pattern recognition, and heuristic processing over sustained analysis. This adaptive shift is not inherently negative. It reflects the need to manage informational complexity under constraint. However, it introduces trade-offs. As reliance on heuristics increases, the capacity for detailed evaluation may decline. Individuals become more efficient at navigating large volumes of information, but less effective at distinguishing subtle differences in accuracy or coherence. Orwell's philosophical concern with clarity thus intersects with a cognitive transformation, the erosion of sustained attention. Complex reasoning requires time, focus, and the ability to hold multiple variables in consideration simultaneously. Accelerated environments disrupt these conditions, encouraging rapid transitions between topics and reducing the depth of engagement with any single issue. The reduction in depth affects not only understanding but memory. Information that is processed quickly and superficially is less likely to be integrated into long-term cognitive structures. This leads to a form of ephemeral knowledge, where individuals are aware of many facts in a transient sense but lack the stable frameworks needed to connect them. The absence of such frameworks complicates reasoning. Without stable conceptual structures, it becomes difficult to evaluate new information in relation to existing knowledge. Each piece of information is processed in relative isolation, increasing susceptibility to framing effects and contextual manipulation. Orwell's emphasis on the relationship between language and thought becomes particularly relevant here. If language is simplified or distorted, and cognition is oriented toward rapid processing, the combination can lead to compressed reasoning, forms of thought that rely on abbreviated expressions and reduced conceptual differentiation. Nuance is lost not only because it is suppressed, but because the cognitive environment does not support its maintenance. This compression has implications for judgment. Decisions may be based on incomplete or oversimplified representations, increasing the likelihood of error. More importantly, the ability to recognize such error may diminish, as the criteria for evaluation themselves become less precise. At the same time, cognition develops compensatory strategies. Individuals may rely more heavily on social cues, using the reactions of others as proxies for evaluation. If a claim is widely accepted within a given network, it may be treated as credible without independent verification. This reliance reduces cognitive load but increases vulnerability to coordinated or systemic distortion. The interplay between individual cognition and collective patterns thus becomes more pronounced. Thought is shaped not only by personal processing, but by the structure of the surrounding informational network. The boundary between individual reasoning and social influence becomes increasingly permeable. Orwell's philosophical framework anticipates this permeability through his analysis of conformity and ideological reinforcement. In technologically mediated environments, these dynamics are amplified. Feedback mechanisms, likes, shares, visibility metrics, provide continuous signals about which interpretations are socially reinforced, influencing both expression and belief. Over time, these signals can recalibrate cognitive priorities. Attention may shift toward content that is more likely to receive reinforcement, even if it lacks depth or accuracy. This creates a feedback loop in which cognitive habits align with the incentives of the informational environment, reinforcing its structure. The long-term effect of this alignment is a potential narrowing of cognitive diversity. If certain patterns of thought are consistently rewarded, alternative patterns may decline. The range of interpretive strategies available to individuals becomes more homogeneous, reducing the system's overall capacity for critical variation. However, adaptation is not unidirectional. Just as environments shape cognition, cognition can reshape how environments are engaged. Individuals and groups can develop practices that counteract the pressures of acceleration and fragmentation, deliberate slowing of analysis, structured evaluation of claims, and the cultivation of conceptual precision. These practices represent forms of cognitive resistance. They do not eliminate environmental pressures but create localized conditions in which deeper reasoning can occur. Their effectiveness depends on consistency and reinforcement. Isolated efforts may be insufficient, but sustained practices can influence broader patterns over time. Education plays a critical role in this context. It can either reinforce adaptive shortcuts or cultivate the skills required for sustained analysis. The design of educational systems, what they emphasize, how they structure learning, affects the long-term development of cognitive habits. Systems that prioritize memorization without understanding may inadvertently support superficial processing, while those that emphasize reasoning can strengthen resilience. Orwell's philosophical orientation suggests that cognitive integrity is both a personal and institutional achievement. Individuals must develop habits of careful thought, but these habits require environments that support their application. Without such environments, even well-developed skills may atrophy. Another dimension of cognitive adaptation concerns the management of uncertainty. In complex environments, uncertainty is unavoidable. The question is how individuals respond to it. One response is to seek premature closure, adopting simplified explanations that reduce ambiguity. Another is to tolerate uncertainty while continuing to evaluate evidence. The capacity to tolerate uncertainty is closely linked to critical thinking. It allows for the maintenance of open questions and the revision of beliefs. However, it is cognitively demanding and often uncomfortable. Systems that reward certainty over accuracy can discourage this capacity, leading to the premature stabilization of belief. Orwell's analysis highlights the risks of such stabilization. When beliefs become fixed despite incomplete or conflicting evidence, the ability to adjust to new information declines. This rigidity can reinforce distortion, as individuals interpret new data in ways that preserve existing conclusions. The preservation of cognitive flexibility thus becomes essential. It involves maintaining the ability to revise beliefs, to integrate new information, and to recognize the limits of current understanding. This flexibility does not imply indecision. It reflects a structured openness to correction. Within this framework, the relationship between cognition and truth remains central. Truth exists independently of cognitive processes, but access to it depends on those processes. If cognition is systematically shaped in ways that reduce clarity, depth, and flexibility, the effective distance between individuals and truth increases. Orwell's philosophical contribution lies in identifying the conditions under which this distance can expand or contract. By understanding how cognition adapts to its environment, it becomes possible to identify points of intervention, practices and structures that support alignment with reality. As the analysis extends further, attention shifts toward the ultimate implications of these transformations. Whether a stable form of rational agency can persist in the long term, and what configurations of environment, practice, and structure are required to sustain the capacity for truth-oriented thought. The philosophical trajectory of George Orwell reaches a critical level when cognition, autonomy, and structural pressures converge on the question of rational agency. The capacity of individuals to make informed, coherent, and responsible decisions within a complex and often distorted environment. If truth, memory, and identity are vulnerable, then the exercise of agency is contingent, shaped both by internal capacities and external constraints. Rational agency requires epistemic competence, the ability to discern reliable information, evaluate evidence, and integrate it into coherent judgments. It also requires temporal continuity, enabling individuals to connect past experiences, current observations, and anticipated consequences. When these capacities are compromised through distortion, fragmentation, or accelerated informational pressure, the scope of agency narrows. Orwell emphasizes that rational agency is inseparable from responsibility. Knowledge confers moral weight. To know what is true, or to have the capacity to discern truth, is to bear an obligation to act in accordance with it. When structures of power interfere with the acquisition or application of knowledge, responsibility is complicated. Individuals may retain partial understanding but lack the full resources to exercise it effectively. The tension between capacity and obligation is central. An agent may understand, to some extent, the distortion of reality, yet find that acting on that understanding is constrained by social, political, or institutional pressures. Compliance, compromise, or silence may be pragmatic strategies, but they carry ethical implications. Orwell's analysis highlights that the moral landscape is shaped not only by overt acts of oppression, but by the conditions that limit the feasible exercise of judgment. This framework underscores the relational nature of agency. Individual decisions are embedded within networks of influence, expectation, and communication. Rationality is therefore context-sensitive. It is exercised relative to the constraints and affordances of one's environment. Awareness of these constraints is itself a component of responsible agency. A further dimension concerns anticipation and foresight. Rational agents must consider not only immediate outcomes but also systemic consequences. In environments where distortion, fragmentation, and acceleration are prevalent, foresight becomes more difficult. Agents must evaluate probabilities, model potential responses, and weigh the reliability of information under uncertainty. The cognitive and emotional demands of such evaluation are significant. Orwell also identifies resistance as an ethical dimension. Where systems actively undermine truth, memory, or autonomy, the preservation of independent judgment becomes a moral act. Resistance need not be dramatic. It can manifest as careful attention, documentation, or the deliberate cultivation of clarity in thought and expression. The ethical significance lies in maintaining the conditions under which rational agency remains possible. Agency is further complicated by the interdependence of actors. Collective rationality emerges when multiple agents coordinate their evaluations, share observations, and critique interpretations. Fragmentation, whether through structural control, technological segmentation, or social isolation, reduces the capacity for such coordination. The moral and practical consequences of collective fragmentation are therefore profound. Truth-oriented action becomes more difficult to realize at scale. In this context, Orwell's framework highlights the importance of norms and practices that support integrity. Shared standards for evaluating claims, open communication channels, and institutional accountability are not merely administrative conveniences. They are essential for sustaining rational agency. Their absence produces a system in which individual judgment is persistently undermined, and ethical responsibility is diffused or obscured. Yet rational agency is never absolute. External pressures, cognitive constraints, and structural distortions ensure that agency is always bounded. The question becomes not whether one can achieve perfect understanding or act without compromise, but whether one can maximize coherence and responsibility within feasible limits. This boundedness implies that ethical action is context-sensitive. Agents must navigate trade-offs, prioritize competing obligations, and negotiate the costs of resistance and compliance. Moral evaluation, from Orwell's perspective, requires attention to both intention and effect, recognizing that systemic constraints shape the range of possible action. The preservation of agency also depends on continuous reflection and adaptation. Cognitive habits, social networks, and institutional frameworks must be actively maintained, corrected, and extended. Passivity leads to erosion. Engagement sustains capacity. In technologically mediated environments, this includes critical attention to information flows, the verification of sources, and the cultivation of interpretive resilience. Orwell's philosophy thus links epistemic competence, moral responsibility, and social embeddedness. Rational agency is neither isolated nor fully determined. It emerges from the interplay of personal capacities, collective structures, and environmental conditions. Its preservation requires vigilance, deliberate practice, and the reinforcement of standards that align perception, judgment, and action. Finally, rational agency, as conceptualized in this framework, is intimately connected to the survival of truth itself. Agents who cultivate discernment and coherence act as nodes in a broader epistemic network. Through sustained attention, critical evaluation, and principled action, they create the conditions under which reality can be recognized, interpreted, and acted upon despite distortion. The persistence of these nodes determines whether human cognition and ethics can function meaningfully under persistent structural and technological pressure. The next stage of analysis examines the interplay between collective coordination and systemic resilience, exploring how groups of agents can sustain rationality and ethical action, even when individual capacities are constrained by complexity, uncertainty, or environmental distortion.